Thank you, and thank you everybody for joining this seminar and for inviting me to this. I think this is the last seminar of this year, if I'm not wrong.
In this series, yeah.
In this series, okay. And I've tried to share my presentation. Please tell me if you can see it. Does it work? Yeah? Okay. Okay. So today I will not talk about only about my book and all the contents of my book, because it's quite impossible during a short seminar, but I would like also to address some questions about the meaning of the terms we use when we deal with the history of the internet, and also with narratives, imaginaries, and myths. And especially why I would like to think with you and through this presentation about the meaning of myths and why myths matter also when we research on the history of networks and the internet. And especially the way in which these ideas, narratives, imaginaries, history conflate and co-shape each other over time. To do this, I will address three main myths that are described and analyzed in my book. The first one is not analyzed in depth in my book, but this is a good occasion. Yes, it's a good opportunity for me to discuss this idea, which is the myth of the military origins of the internet, and especially the relationship between the dangers of a nuclear attack and the birth of the ARPANET project. The second one is more related to the way in which narrative patterns are used to tell the history of innovation, and especially the history of great inventors and inventions. And in this case, I will talk about a very mainstream narrative, which is the narrative of the invention of the World Wide Web by Tim Berners-Lee. And finally, I will talk about a local, national history, which is the history of an infrastructure project that I analyzed in this book. That is the project called Socrate, which was the main infrastructure project of the Italian telecommunication company Telecom Italia in the 90s. I know that in previous seminars you talked a lot about users, and I think that the history of users is an essential and probably the most essential part that we should study in this time. In this case, I will talk mainly about mainstream narratives and what I call in the book the dominant narrative of internet history, which is a quite linear and Western-oriented narrative based in the US and partially in Europe. The first myth that I want to address today is the myth of the military origins of the internet, and especially of the ARPANET project. As you may know, the ARPANET project is described as reaction to the power of the Soviet Union, who launched the Sputnik in 1957. And so the US invested a lot of money for basic research, and the technological reaction to this the goal of the Sputnik was the ARPANET project. It's somehow a story of a mainstream narrative inside another mainstream narrative, which is the Cold War. But I would like to take a step back before addressing this point, and is related to the perspective I used to think about the history of media in relationship to the term and the idea of biography. I own Simone Natale for his perspective on this, because when we talk about the history of media and technologies, we usually use terms and narrative patterns based on biographies. We talk about the birth of media, the death of media. We talk about old media. We describe media as living beings, which with their own story. And the birth of the internet, the birth of television, the birth of radio, the birth of media is a recurrent topic in this sense. In Western culture, also the pop culture used this idea of new media that kill old media. The internet kills television, which is not true, of course. And especially we think of the genealogy, the first moment in which a medium came into reality as a birth. There's this memory square out of the office of Berners-Lee, where it's written where the web was born, not invented, not created, not programmed, but born. And there's a topos in media history, a recurrent narrative that links the birth of media with a specific emotion, which is fear. Usually when we talk about the history of radio, television, or other media, there are always some anecdotes that describe a first time in which these media came to light and terrified people, terrified humanities. It's the example of the television when John Logie Baird invented television. He tried to promote television through newspapers, and he went to the daily experts to promote this invention. The story tells that the news editor was terrified in front of this man and this invention. And he said, for God's sake, go down to the reception and get rid of a lunatic who's down here, there. He says he's got a machine for seeing by wireless. It's crazy, it's dangerous. Watch him, he may have razor in him. Similar anecdotes relate to the history, for instance, of motion picture. The most famous is called the train effect, when the Lumiere's brother projected the first movie in Paris. The people inside the cinema, the theater, were terrified by this train, which was going directly into the theater and out of the screen. Many historians have demonstrated that this is not a true story, but people were not terrified by this event. Anyway, today, this myth, this genealogical story is still used to describe the power of cinema and motion picture to change reality. And the same is for radio. One of the founding stories about the history of radio is the event of the War of Words, when Orson Welles told this fiction story on radio, and people were terrified by the invasion of aliens on Martians on the US. So there's always this fear of new media when media become new. But when it comes to the internet, the story is quite different. The internet is narrated as a reaction to the fear of the nuclear attack, and especially the packet switching, which was in part programmed and designed to avoid the loss of information due to a nuclear attack by Paul Baran. and especially this paper by Paul Barron, which was influential but not so influential for the foundation of ARPANET, has become the picture, the most famous representation of the internet and the way in which the internet is a distributed network. And in this paper, Barron talked about the dangers of a nuclear attack, and the idea was that a distributed network could avoid the loss of information because information could be spread to all the nodes. But anyway, this idea became also a political idea. The idea of a distributed network in which horizontality, egalitarianism could be represented through a very simple design. And Paul Barron was also charged of the responsibility of this process. But I like this quote in which he says, I get credit for a lot of things I didn't do. I just did a little piece on packet switching and I get blamed for the whole goddamn internet, you know? Why this idea is important? Because contrary to the other narratives, the narrative of the internet as a technology to protect the US from a nuclear attack does not link fear with the new technology. The new technology is rather a way to defend, is a protective new media. And I really like this book by Jung Hu, in which he says, if the internet never had this nuclear-proof shape, then why do scholars continually tell or write this idea back into existence? In other words, I'm interested less in debunking the myth than in the reason that it persists in digital culture. There is, in short, a collective desire to keep the myth alive, despite evidence to the contrary. And another problem, however, is that the distributed network, this idea of the internet as a distributed network, was never built. If you look also at the infrastructural maps of the internet, we can see how the internet is not equally distributed worldwide. But however, this idea persists over time. This myth persists over time, and to some extent, it resists history or historical counterfacts. This is interesting for me because the internet is different from other media because it's invested with good values and with positive values since the beginning of this main dominant narrative of internet history. A second point that I would like to address is the myth of the web's birth. It's somehow related to this idea of the biography of media, and especially if we look, for instance, at the most famous books that deal with the foundation, the history of the early web. The most famous, together with the book by Tim Berners-Lee, is How the Web Was Born by James Gillis and Robert Cailliau. Cailliau was the co-inventor of the World Wide Web. And I worked on this topic in other papers and also in my book together with Gabriele Balbi and with Simone Natale, trying to reconstruct also how the biography of the web was narrated. And basically, the web, the birth of the web is not so researched, and so, in my opinion, it's not so important to historians today because it's to some extent taken for granted. It's such an important and big innovation with a clear positive value that is difficult to, I don't say to challenge, but to try to look in depth at its real history. This is also because the web has created a mythological aura based also on the hero who invented the web, who is Tim Berners-Lee. And in the paper with Manatar, in my book, I try to compare the history of Tim Berners-Lee as been narrated mainly by Berners-Lee and apologetic writers and journalists, how this history can be compared with a narrative pattern as designed by Joseph Campbell, who wrote this book, The Year with a Thousand Faces. And the idea of Campbell was that in different cultures and traditions, heroes and the way in which the story of the hero is narrated follow a common pattern. There's something also, this is something similar also to the famous book by Prop on the morphology of the fairy tale. And the idea in Campbell books is that there are three main stages of the hero's journey, the journey that the hero takes to reach his goal. The first one is the departure or the call to adventure. The second is the initiation, the mission to accomplish. The third is the return and the new call to adventure. And these three stages can be linked to the story of Berners-Lee. If we look at the mainstream books and articles written about the history of the web. First of all, this idea of the departure, call to adventure, is based on the idea that there's a predestination of the genius of the inventor that access, or the hero, that access a new world. In the case of Berners-Lee, this new world was CERN in Geneva, which was the perfect place to invent the web because it was a place based on openness in which researchers could be free to research and to create something new. There's also the relevance of chance and the link between different eras. For instance, Berners-Lee created the web thanks to the next computer created by another hero of digital history, who is Steve Jobs. And as Berners-Lee says in his book, I happened to come along with time and the right interest and inclination after hypertext and the internet to come of age. The task left to me was to marry them together. So the role of chance is crucial also in this narrative pattern. A second point is the initiation, when the hero has to face and overcome different troubles and problems. And the challenge, the big challenge for Berners-Lee was to demonstrate that the web was useful to people, and especially to users, to librarians, to scientists, and to the hypertext community. And there's a long list of examples of Berners-Lee and Robert Caillou who go together to conferences trying to demonstrate the importance of the web, even if their project was rejected by the conference committee at the beginning, for instance. And finally, there's another step, which is, in my opinion, the most important, which is the sacrifice of the hero. Why Berners-Lee and the web entail are both invested with positive and moral values, because the web is a gift to humanity. And according to newspapers, magazines, historians as well, Berners-Lee is a hero because of the sacrifice. He gave the web for free. As Robert Wright wrote on Time magazine, he's the unsung hero of the information age. And he compares Berners-Lee to Gutenberg, more or less. Cathy Hafner, who was one of the most apologetic journalists of internet history, she says Berners-Lee is precisely the kind of hero that a relatively simple invention with profound social and economic consequences should lay claim to. It's not just creative, but democratic, diplomatic, polite, and generous. And this is another aspect that the web took these positive values from his inventor. Marcel Mauss, in his famous book, The Gift, says, the gift brings with itself the donor's identity. In this case, the web brings with itself the Berners-Lee identity and polite, democratic, diplomatic attitude. Again, Andrew Keen on C-SPAN in 2013 said that Berners-Lee could have owned the World Wide Web, but it was very publicly spirited. And finally, this hero, according to the narrative pattern by Campbell, has to return to home and has a new call to adventure. He should restart, start again his adventure. And actually, the World Wide Web, which is depicted as an European invention, moved to the United States, where he started a new call to adventure, which was to protect the web from the threats of privatization, commercialization, and the turning to an oligarchic organization rather than a distributed network. And of course, there's also the institutionalization of the euro. Berners-Lee becomes Sir in the UK. Statues are built for him. He got the Turing Award and so on. So this became a very important era of the information age, which represents the invention itself, the World Wide Web. Somehow this narrative construction, this pattern is useful. It's useful because it put a face on new technologies, provided familiar narrative pattern, and facilitates also the symbolic domestication of technology. Because the positive values of the internet and of the web in this case are integrated in society and make these technologies less dangerous, compared to other technologies, like I said before. And there's also an historical continuity because this invention created in Europe moved to the center of gravity of the internet, which is the US, and it conflicts with what I call the dominant narrative of internet history, which is basically a US-based narrative. There are many risks in this myth, in this story, in my opinion. The first one is the ambiguity and falsification of history, and also the problem of recognizing the differences between different systems, which is not the case of historians or informatics, but of common citizens. For instance, the comparison, the overlap between the internet and the web, which are not, of course, the same thing. But also these biographies act as a form in corporate communication. They call it a pasteurization of the narrative, which means that you exclude the bacteria, the problematic parts of a narrative to make emerge only a clear, sharp, and positive narrative of internet history. And so the hubris of the era, for instance, the problem that Berners-Lee allowed the commercial use of the web, which was also a reason of the web's success, is not so important in this narrative, while, as we know, the commercial web was the turning point of the web in the 90s. And of course, these are geographies. If we rely only on this exemplary history, monumental history, according to Nietzsche, we oversimplify history. Andrew Russell described this issue quite well in his papers. And finally, the third myth that I want to address, but before, let me see the time. I have 17 minutes. Okay. The last myth that I would like to address is an infrastructural project in Italy in the 90s. It's related to myths because it contrasts with the idea that the 90s were the decade in which telecom companies invested massively in internet technology. I researched in the archives of this company, Telecom Italia, which was one of the most powerful telecom companies worldwide, at least from an economic perspective. And the idea of Telecom Italia was to cable the whole country, and especially starting from the 19 main cities of the country, with a new infrastructure, with a new broadband infrastructure. This was a reaction to the need for a new infrastructure to face the so-called information society. And this is another big narrative of the 90s, the idea to build the information superhighways, as Al Gore and Clinton promoted in the US, but we can trace back this idea of the need for new information infrastructures also in France and in other countries, where reports talk about the relevance of the informatization, computerization in English of society. And another problem was that at the end of the 90s, Europe would open up the competition between telecom companies. So the new market was a threat to the monopoly of Telecom Italia, the Italian telecommunication company in the 90s. So Telecom Italia decided to build its own infrastructure in order to control the market in the following years. It's interesting how the materiality and the way in which the infrastructure was created represent somehow the imaginary behind this project. Telecom Italia decided to build the national infrastructure in optical coaxial cables. This meant that you can download a big amount of data at the time, but you could not upload much data, but just a few data. So the idea was that this network would be realized for downstreaming, download, and not for upload. The level of interaction allowed by this infrastructure was very low. Why this? Because eventually the idea of Telecom Italia was not to create a network for the internet or for interactive communication, but for broadcasting. And the idea was that cabling, this is Ernesto Pascale, who was the CEO of Telecom Italia at the time. According to Pascale, cabling is the technological evolution of telecommunication. And he said, I'm confident in the multimedia market. I'm sure that we are at the beginning of an era that will change our way of working. I feel in my flesh that is going to happen. But according to Pasquale, this new revolution that was about to start was the interactive multimedia television. He said a new television will be added to general television with which it will compete. An additional supplementary and part substitute world is coming up, and it offers tremendous opportunities. Later, when the project failed, Menetti, a journalist on the Corriere della Sera, which is the first Italian journal, the first Italian newspaper, said the fiber optic network wanted by Pascale was not like the telephone line, which allows anyone to connect with anyone, but was rather like an aqueduct, with the broadcast signal from above, which was spread to homes through a tree-based scheme. It was another network with no connection to the telephone line, like the internet, but it was a cable television. So the idea in this case was to build a national infrastructure for a broadcasting network, in line also with the media tradition of Italy, in which television is a key medium, is a central medium. And this was also one of the reasons of the failure of this project. The first one is very technological, and is the emergence of faster protocols and lines like the ADSL, which use the normal copper cables used for telephones. There was another problem that deals with materiality. When you build a new infrastructure, you have to dig. And this is interesting in interviews I made for my research, in which manager and people in the Ministry of Communication says the problem was to dig. Municipalities gave us the permits to dig, but asked in return expensive street renovation. They also found a mess of different infrastructures when the telecom network manager says it was basically digging, but there were also improper crossing of other companies that had destroyed the pipelines we made before. And finally, from an economic point of view, to make the network as little cost in Italy, what was very expensive was digging. The 80% of the recommendations asked to the Ministry of Communication were to convince municipalities to dig. It's a lot of money. So this is another aspect of how networks costs at material level. And finally, there was also a problem of the missing market. Telecom Italia itself said in 2004 that the problem was that the market was missing and the technology and the market did not meet each other. A telecom engineer says, we as Italian and Europeans were not ready for broadband service at all. But the problem also was that Telecom Italia decided to invest on broadcasting television and not on internet services. This is also why Italy laid behind in the following years. And when I interviewed the CEO of Telecom Italia, he said the internet was like it did not exist. He saw for the first time the internet, thanks to another engineer, which is Maurizio Decina. And this year says, when I saw the internet for the first time, I felt a mixture of anguish and something else. I was abandoned in the sea. It was like seeing a new dimension coming up, a dimension that was absolutely unknown at the time, in 1995. We had two great paths ahead. The first was the broadband network, and the other was the mobile phone. So the national strategy of one of the most important telecom companies in Europe was based on broadband services. The project failed, and also at the material level, it's interesting to see how the cables laid for the Socrates project are still there. I call them the ruins of this project. And in some cases, we can see also the overlap between different infrastructures. The new fiber optic infrastructure by Telecom Italia put new cabinets, like in the picture on your right, on the old cabinets of Socrates. And I also read on some forums of clients, of customers, who cannot use the new fiber optic cables of Telecom Italia because there are still the old cables of Socrates in their canteens. So this is also somehow a material manifestation of the product of the imagery of this telecom company in the 90s. There's a sort of chain of consequences that is visible at material level today. To conclude, I would like to address three final points on why do internet myths matter. These are only 3 points, but we can go on and on for hours, in my opinion. The first one is that these myths, as part of the symbolic domestication of technology, they make familiar the unfamiliar. They provide technological artifacts with social and moral values. This idea of the distributed network, the idea of the web as an inherently positive innovation. Secondly, these myths persist in the social imaginary, and they also resist historical counterfacts and influence also technological, political, and cultural processes. And finally, they provide also ideological foundations up to protect a glorious past and also to resist change, in my opinion, today. I give you some examples here. This is the Olympics in London in 2012, when Berners-Lee sent this message to the world: this is for everyone. The web is for everyone, is a democratic service, is public service somehow. And I also like this quote from Berners-Lee 10 years before, when he said, in a way, historians, with all due respect, can do the world a disservice by only picking out particular people, because it makes the history easier to just talk about Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, or Berners-Lee. He said, I would hope I would be remembered as just a regular, ordinary person, totally full of faults, just like everybody else. This is not true. 10 years later, Berners-Lee is represented as the hero of the information age, as the hero that has to protect the web from future threats. And also at the local level, some narratives repeat themselves. And I also compared, for instance, the newspaper of the Italian newspapers in the 90s and in 2017, for instance. And the new project to create a national infrastructure in fiber optic cables is described in the very same way in which it was described in 1996, Socrates, where a giant, it was the State Telecom, the Italian telecommunication giant, who, thanks to Socrates, wants to bring the bel paese, the beautiful country, in the digital era. Today, this new project, Open Fiber, is described as the plan to cable it and bring it into the digital era, as we are, like if we are not in the digital era. And the leader of the project, the state power giant, has the mission to bring Italy in this new age. This myth also persists in the social imaginary, creating also new forms of political organization. And Italy, it's interesting how the government party, the Five Star Movement, was born using the metaphor of the network as the new organizational model for politics in Italy. The idea was that all the nodes of the network were the same. This network will change politics and the way in which the old politics work. But it also integrated the constant tension between centralization and decentralization, because this party actually was led by a comedian, a television comedian, who was Beppe Grillo. And this party is still professing this idea of the network, the distributed network, the web, that has to decide about political issues. This is an example also of, this is the software used by this party, which is called Rousseau. Rousseau is one of the founders of the network ideology, according also to Pierre Bourdieu, a French sociologist. This is the system of the Five-Star Movement. I say these myths provide the ideological foundation up to protect a glorious past. If we think at the web, we have to protect the web. And on the left, you have an article about the web we have to save, the old web. We must take back the web we had in the past, as the web, the original web, was the only and good one. Still the contract for the web, the Magna Carta for the web. It's the technology that we have, the treasure of the hero that we have to safeguard and protect today. To conclude, because I think I'm running out of time, I would like to conclude just opening a question also open the discussion with you. When I think about myths, narratives, imaginaries, and history, I think we are usually, we tend to think about history as something that can revise myths, narratives, and imaginaries. History is the discipline that can change the way in which myths are told, also the style of the narratives, and history can change the imaginaries about networks and internet. But in my opinion, we can also think about history as something that serves to understand, explain, and contextualize them. Because fundamentally, basically, myths are part of the history of the internet. They also drove the history of the internet over time and still guiding the way in which we look at this technology and the future of this technology. I think I'm done, and thank you for your attention.
Well, it's perfect timing, Paolo. Thank you very much. And I will stop a timer now. And yeah, I have a funny idea that the myth in your presentation is like a theory in Imre Lakato's view, that a theory is something which can resist counterfacts. It is and the more it can resist, the more it is scientific. So it is a point which he attacked by his book about the scientific theories. So if you have a question, dear colleagues, I ask you to raise your hand in Zoom, using a Zoom functional. And I have a question which I'd like to ask. If I correctly understand your point in your book about a narrative turn in historiography of anything, narrative turn told us that we can't find the real historical events. We can work only with narratives, and even a question what was the truth is absurd, because we can't move to a past and see it and check which narrative is more real. So is it true? And in this, and if it is true, if I correctly understand your point, how can we say that history can revise narratives? Myth.
It's a good question. I'm partner of a project I also contributed to write on the history of the World Wide Web. And recently we got access to certain archives, and especially to the protected archives, the archives that are still under secrecy from 1987 to 1994. And we already found some new sources that could be useful to revise, or at least to challenge parts of the myth of the web's origins. But the real problem when we discuss these archives and the materials that we have, we said, actually, what we really need to understand what really happened, it's an ethnography. But it's impossible to make an ethnographic research on something that has already happened and in in a world that is changed. And this is part of the problem that if we don't leave the events, we cannot understand, we cannot find the real truth. We cannot even think to reach this goal in our research. But I think history in this case, it's essential to not to revise myth, but also to create the way in which the narratives about the internet will be taught in the future. I think that the mission of history is the future, not the past in this sense. Because, and here I use the term imaginary, because the imaginary is something that changes over time and is not a stable, fixed concept, but it's something, as Castoriadis says, is a magma. It's something that is continuously shaped by the narratives we use in our context. So I think this is the mission of history in this sense, not to demonstrate that the myths are false, but to make these myths more complex, to add new histories, add new narrative pattern, new actors, and also different angles from which you can see and perceive at imaginary level the technology and its past. I don't know if my answer was.
Oh yeah, it's cool, and it's a place where Castoriadis and Latour meet together. So we are like other actors. We are part of the myth space. We can't move from it, so we need to be in it, and we need to understand what is happened. So, Mitya, you have a question, as far as I can see.
Yeah, I have a question, but since I'm not like an internet researcher, I'm more of a political theorist, my question will be in that more in that field. I read only 2 first chapters of your book, unfortunately, but I had the feeling that, you know, the kind of narratives on the internet history concerns most of all values kind of adopted in the layout of technology, like social and political values, that at some point the myth gets transformed and the whole technology kind of reproduces these values in a semi-autonomous ways, and due to the myth we perceive it as some kind of determinist force that just happens to us, and we don't know what to do about it. We simply think that there is no alternative to Google, and we can't really even come up with something. But at the same time, I had a question about 5-star movement, because 5-star movement for me kind of encapsulate the spirit. So Casaleggio was like avid reader of Wired and Kevin Anderson and all these guys. And so he basically kind of built up on this myth of decentralized and vertical organization. And so in a sense, Rousseau is not a democratic platform, it's a platform for acclamation. When Di Maio was appointed, there were no competition there, right? And so what does it mean that this kind of myth busting, this complication implies a certain stand or a certain opening up of political alternatives, so kind of techno-political experimentation, etc. Because for Castoriadis, for instance, you know, he had this idea that there is imaginary and there is this kind of symbolic digital structure which is not malleable. So you have this binary logic, you can't do anything about it, but symbolic imaginary organization can finally bring about, let's say, more autonomous social project at the intersection of politics and technology. So I'm wondering, like, are you actually speaking about different internet, or is it implicit, this kind of idea? Because when you use Castoriadis and you go like this, it's a kind of natural,
Yeah.
conclusion.
It's a very complex issue because I think that if you look at the history, for instance, of the five-star movement, it's quite interesting because at the very beginning, this model of organization of political action, in my opinion, was very productive. At the very beginning, the single nodes all around the country were building up a new form of political participation at local level. The problem was when the five-star movement went to the government and became a real powerful political force in the country. And it had to deal with the verticalization of the network somehow, because you needed representatives, you needed that these representatives had to decide in a short time about political laws and decrees and so on. And so the base, this horizontal network was a little bit abandoned by the parliament, or the members of the parliament. And these members of the parliament had also to deal with other networks, centralized networks like other right-wing and left-wing parties and so on. So the idea to create a new political party which will have success only thanks to this new organizational model, it's not something that can be realized in our political system. Of course, you can find a way to negotiate better the distribution of power within the movement, within the party. But the idea that a software, a platform, an online platform can become the turning point for this form of organization is crazy. And also it's in the end of a private company, which is the Casaleggio Associati. And this is another contradiction of the five-star movement. If you have a look, for instance, at the books by Pierre Mousseau, he uses this concept of, is one of the first to use the concept of network ideology. This idea that networks by themselves can change the way in which we organize economics, politics, and so on. Thanks to the distributed vision of the network, because also, if you look back at Rousseau, the idea of Rousseau was to bring back the sky on the earth thanks to the transportation networks and the unification of the entire globe. This is a very old idea, and is a kind of technological determinism or engineeristic determinism, this architecture, design determinism. And it's something that I criticize also in my book, because there's this idea that we are in the end of something that is led by itself to the contemporary situation in which we have Google, Facebook, and the new form of centralization of the network today. The problem is that we are putting on the side, excluding also the real ideological perspectives that can nourish or feed the network with something. And we are only looking at technology as the model for social and political change. This is something that had success at the beginning in Italy, at the beginning, it was also positive, in my opinion, because it somehow put people together in a place to discuss about political issues in a country where politics were not something important to individuals or to single subjects. And at the beginning, it was something that was useful to have a political life somehow in your city or village in Italy or whatever. But in the end, it turned to be something that could not be applied at macro level. Here we can go on talking about the Greeks and Agora and all the political organizations in centuries and centuries, but I would stop here on this topic. Thank you, Mitya.
So, and if somebody want to ask something, so you can raise your hand in a Zoom way or to turn on your camera. And I have another question. Listening your the conversation about the imaginaries in a Castoriadis way and the utopia, because it is the similar ideas. But as far as I can see and as far as I can understand, the imaginary is more about the big scale of social organization and time. So it's more constant, and the utopia can be utopia of a small collective of people or something, but both of them connected to the political reality and to technological things and have a moral dimension. And Tim Berners-Lee and his ideas about the web and the new world with the web and in a web looks like an utopia. So and in this perspective, he is just a builder of this new thing and of this new way. How do we communicate and how do we, gather an information? And is it correct that if we choose a concept of imaginary, we can see something that we can see if we look from the utopia side, or it is or it's a bad idea?
I think the concept of the imaginary is crucial because it's something that goes behind the definition of a single narrative or a single myth or a single utopia. Imaginary is more a system of beliefs in which all these concepts converge. This is why, in my opinion, it's important to use the term imaginary in this sense. And at the same time, when we talk about Tim Berners-Lee, I think that the character of Tim Berners-Lee perfectly represents the technological determinism, the idea of the technological expertise as the new political expertise that guides and drives some political perspective. At the beginning of my book, I use a quote by Berners-Lee, which is, "The structure is everything."
Mm-hmm.
Which is full of ideological content, a sentence like this. If we look at Steve Jobs, one of the the most famous quote of Steve Jobs is, "Design is everything." Still, it's always about the architecture, the structure, the design of things, not about the contents of things or how we use things to do something, but how things are organized, designed, and structural, infrastructural idea of political modeling of contemporaneity. This is how an ideology, and also maybe an utopia, but I don't see the point to which this utopia, the final goal of this utopia, if not a realization of a technological structure, infrastructure, or what else. But the problem is not Berners-Lee. I think Berners-Lee is a crucial figure, is a very important actor also in the political debate today. The problem is the centralization of the narrative on one man, on one technology as the solution to our political, economic, and social problems.
So the utopia in this perspective is something which is inside of a man, it's his ideas, and the narrative is something which is outside. Like
yes, I think utopia is a very subjective meaning, but I didn't work so much on this term and the history of this term, so I don't want to take all steps in defining utopia and dystopia.
So, because I found a picture, you can see it now, and it's not a picture by Tim Berners-Lee; it's a picture by journalists. So, and we need to say that this myth was created by who? By him, or by people who wrote about it and make him a father figure, or it is a from two sides movement?
I think both. On the one hand, Berners-Lee, in telling his own history, biography, and publishing it, and also promoting it, created or at least narrated the main features of the hero and the invention. At the same time, I think it's again something very easy and useful to have a positive and apologetic narrative of the origins of this technology, like in the case of the ARPANET as a tool for national defense, and the web as something universal and for everyone, created in a free and horizontal environment, which was CERN, and CERN represents the most important public institution in Europe, and so you have a lot of symbolic pieces, blocks that build this building, which is the myth of the web. And it's something useful also for companies, because if we look at the way in which companies like Facebook or Google promoted themselves, especially in the 90s or early 2000s, they used the very same narrative of the web. May make the world more open and connected, according to the claim by Zuckerberg. And the idea of the Google was to make perfect the web through a special and wonderful search engine and so on. So this narrative were also exploited somehow by private companies to create and then to keep their position in the market. And there's of course, this is of course a contradiction, because they are creating a sort of centralization of the network that is narrated as distributed, decentralized, and so on. But it works. Or
Yeah,
at least it worked. And now I think the critical perspectives of the internet are stronger. We are facing a big change in this sense, and it's also the reason behind publication of books against, not against, but of books trying to retrace and challenge the linear dominant narrative of internet history, and so on.
But now we have a new internet, the space internet, and we have the pretty similar ideological statements from that guys. Yeah, like Elon Musk, and we have 20 plus projects in different countries who work with these technologies, and they say that we want to open the information for people who don't have an access and so on. And it's pretty the same, and it's very interesting how the new infrastructure take old ideas to work with, and to, of course, to find the money and legitimation. But I think it's not only the history about the money, but it's a history about an internet itself. Because when we build the internet, what do we think about? Yeah, the transparency and all these ideas. And it's a very interesting topic to research, to find when and where in non-European networks the mainstream history appeared in discourse. So when Russian providers started to say the same that Tim Berners-Lee, because so they start from their own point of think what about the network technologies like in Tomsk or in Moscow. And later, as far as I can see in my materials, they started to talk about openness, and it's very interesting to find when and where it was happened. And moreover, I'd like to ask about the following small thing. I heard that there is a picture, I couldn't find it now, but people say that there is a picture with Tim Berners-Lee who have a table, I am not a father of the internet.
Yeah.
And what does it mean? Does it mean that myth can resist not only counterfacts, but even its internal difficultness with the main figure of this myth who wanted to go away? So
actually, this anecdote is also related to the 25th anniversary of the World Wide Web. And in that case, there were Tim Berners-Lee and Vint Cerf together on the stage with two different shirts. Tim Berners-Lee had the shirt, "I'm not the inventor of the internet," and Vint Cerf, "I'm not the inventor of the web." So they tried somehow to clarify this difference in terms of inventorship. I think this is, of course, this is not a problem for us, for historians or for tech enthusiasts and so on. This is a problem with public, with the general public, and the way in which the general public conceive and perceive technology, and also the history of technology. I think that most of people don't know anything about the history of the internet. But in these cases, I think myths or mainstream narratives can somehow reach the ears and the minds of people. So I think this is an act also to show to public opinion, to the general public, the difference between these two characters, but nothing more. I think it was just something pop.
Yeah, and it's interesting how strong the myth will really be, whether if I say Berners-Lee come out and says, "Come on, let's tell another fairy tale." So will it be ruined or not? And it's speculative, of course, but however, I think it's interesting. It's in a degree of resistance of different myths. Paulina, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you very much. It was very, I'm glad to see you, and it was very interesting to listen. I have a question that probably, continues the learners and your answer about the mainstream and what is general public here, and what is the role of the research narrative also in constructing this mainstreamness from your point of view?
This is, I think in this case, we have to call into attention another actor, which is the institutions and people who make public history, what we call public history. Which is, of course, the mediator, the medium between historians and the general public. So museums, media channels dedicated to history, or also not only the role of public history, but also of fiction, of movies, literature, and so on. If you look, for instance, at the history of computing, it's becoming more and more relevant also in mainstream, or if you look at, for instance, at Hollywood, the character of Alan Turing, how has come up suddenly in the public, in the general public discourses. So of course, we have also to find a way to make these stories, our research, interesting to the general public. So we have to be capable of mixing in a professional, but also fascinating way, narrative and history. This is not easy. I'm not sure we are all capable of doing this, but we have also to dialogue and to find a way to communicate with public history institutions and to tell stories to people who also create new historical representations also at fictional level. But this is another problem, the relationship between academia, economic companies, and so on. So this is a long debate, I think.
Yeah, but as far as I understood in your answer, you mean that for you, there is a difference between the historical and scientific papers and the mythological ones, and it's like, disenchantment of the world. And I wonder whether this, how does this point of view works with the idea of imaginaries that are, let's say, from just a different perspective on what, I suppose, a bit different perspective, where is the role of research and the border between the myth and the history is like at least blurred there or not? So whether for you the border between the history and the myth, between what you do and what is the subject of your research are completely different.
I think that over time history has created myths, and we are also responsible of the myths of the future to some extent. I don't think there's a clear separation, a clear boundary between the two things. So, of course, I think there's an impact of historical research on the way in which stories are narrated, and there's a problem of communication between different institutions and also different professional backgrounds and also languages, because this historical research and the way in which history is constructed, traced, and so on, it's usually often very particularistic, it's complex, it's full of details, while myths, as I said before, usually need to be simplified, to be easy to understand, easy to be familiarized by people. This is, of course, a problem of transduction, I would say.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
You.
And I hope it also works with Leonia's question about the narratives, right? Because here I hear the difference between types of narratives, like not only in their, let's say, content, but also in the way of crafting it, right?
Yeah, also on the style.
Interesting. Yeah, does it match also probably your question about the narrative?
Well, yeah, I think so, but I wanted to clarify a small piece of a story about narrative. So I think I heard from you that we can say that some myth is okay and some other is not true at all. Yeah, that in real, Tim Berners-Lee did not the only inventor, but there was a seamless web, and companies use it too. So, but I know that it was my first question of this discussion, but I think that we come back to it, or probably I'm wrong, but that we are still want to see which myth is closer to reality, or probably we need to say that the reality is not. We can't see it, and we only can say that this myth is used by somebody to do something, that it is just a resource of work or of political strategy or something. So I think it's the two very different ideas that we can say what is more truly, and if we can say. So can you clarify it? Do we need to think about myth and reality, or we lose reality and work on a mythological space of myths like constellations of narratives and ideas?
I don't think that we should oppose myths to reality at all, but they are part of reality and of the construction of reality in everyday life from a subjective, but also from a collective perspective. I like one definition of myths. There are many definitions of myths, of the term myth in history. One of the latest I read is myth is a bridge between the human and the cosmos. It's very powerful definition, but it's a way to give meaning to the connection between us and the rest and the world. I think they are essential, and history will never, if history wants to replace somehow myths, it will never replace myths, because we need them. So I'm not against myths in this sense, but I think it's important to understand, or at least to think about the way in which we use myths, in which we perceive them, in which we share our vision on myths with others. So the example of the companies using exploiting myths for their own interest is just one example of how myths permeate and are part of our social life, and are part of reality, of course. I don't know if I answered your, of course, from my point of view, your
maybe you decided that I wanted to point you somehow that a myth is like a fairy tale or like a something, you know, in the air, but I only meant whether we could talk about fidelity of the myth, about the myth and what was happened in the past, if we will build, you know, the time machine and go to the past, do we saw this or something another? So only it was my interest.
Yeah, of course, it's impossible to give a good answer to this question, in my opinion. But another important relevant point, I'm not sure if we go to the past, even if we go in the past, I'm not sure we would realize the truth that is coming up during our experience. I think we will always cut out something from our memory in the very instant contemporary moment in which we take an action. So I think it's impossible to revise a myth, even when the myth is in a stage of birth, if we want to go back to the biographical metaphor.
So Mitya, you probably have to
yeah, I got one question. Sorry. No. I got a cat, she's crazy. So, what do you think on recent developments concerning data governance and data legislation on European Union level as a kind of, you know, policy of myth busting of a certain way? Well, thing that Francesca Bria did in Barcelona, etc. I don't know if you follow, perhaps you did follow that. So is it kind of, you know, strategy that combines a certain academic, you know, research, and at the same time proactive kind of alternative making action? And so I just want to hear your opinion as a kind of European citizen, let's say.
I think that it's not my specific field of research, but I know something about it. I think there are different layers somehow. I think, of course, research, for instance, on open data and smart cities and so on, is contributing somehow to the political organization of some examples, especially in Europe. And I think not only in Barcelona, but also in some cities here in Italy, this partnership, this cooperative attitude between research institutions, political institutions, citizenship is fruitful and useful. At the same time, if you look at the macro level, there's this big narrative that the European Union must be the moderator between the capitalist version of the internet and the public service, because Europe is the old continent that has this historical background based in public service, welfare state, and so on. And this is something very simplistic, in my opinion. Of course, laws like the GDPR are important, the discussion with Zuckerberg and Facebook are important, but it's just one of the many issues that must be addressed at political level with companies, with single national states, and so on. And this is a big discussion. But of course, I think internet researchers are contributing also to political advancements in some countries, and especially in the case of Barcelona, in UK's with the open data project and so on. So I don't know to what extent historians are contributing to that, but that's another.
So I think it was the last question, because we're in time. Paolo, thank you very much. It was very interesting and very mind and alarm for mind to think about what do we catch in our interviews, that it is indeed a narratives, and of course it's very naive if we think that in interviews like 25 years after some events in computer network history, we can catch the past as it is. And so in this way, narratives look like a good way to think about it. But for me, this seminar and your book was something very new, because I didn't have enough brave to say that I am not, the true historian of the past as it is, but I work with narratives and memory in an interview. It is important, and your book was for me very important because of it.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, and thank you all.
Thank you very much.